We begin tonight with a plea for help from emergency crews helping civilians in Ukraine. World leaders call what's happening there war crimes. Full stop. Including officials here in the U.S. as the danger grows and people are more and more desperate to get out. On the Hill, former Trump administration advisor Michael Flynn, remember him? Well, he met with lawmakers investigating the Capitol insurrection, but the January 6th committee may not be getting the answers they were hoping for. Then you've seen it for yourself. Gas, food, housing, all of it surging in cost. How bad is inflation really getting? Well, it's at levels we haven't seen in 40 years. How much worse it could get, that's coming up. And baseball is back. It took almost 100 days, but MLB owners and players have a deal for now. Then we'll take you behind the scenes of Louisiana's harshest juvenile facility, where kids are allegedly being held in solitary confinement for almost an entire day. Some shackled even outside their cells. We're going to be reporting that out in tonight's Backstory. Hey everyone, I'm Vicki Nguyen in for Hallie Jackson, and we are coming on the air with new reaction to that horrible maternity hospital bombing. The EU's chief saying it could be considered a war crime, and the U.S. ambassador to the UN just a short time ago saying Russia's actions against the Ukrainian people are a war crime. The comments follow growing outrage from leaders in the West and Ukraine over the horrific attack that killed 3 people, including a child. Vice President Kamala Harris, too, condemning that attack. She's in Poland tonight, meeting with the country's president and Ukrainian refugees. A big diplomatic test for her there to prove the U.S.'s commitment to Poland and other NATO allies is, as she calls it, ironclad. This all as people in Ukraine are still trying to get out as fast as they can, with the destruction there just growing. Now, U.S. officials say Russian forces could encircle Kyiv in just a week or two, though they believe Ukraine is in a position to hold Russians at bay for several more weeks. Russian forces are now within 10 miles of Kyiv's city center on the northwestern route. This comes after top diplomats from Russia and Ukraine say they failed to make any progress to end the war today. Ukraine's foreign minister saying surrendering to Russia, well, that's not an option. The UN is now estimating 549 civilians have been killed over the course of this war, 41 of them children. But they say the actual number, it's likely much higher. Meanwhile, emergency workers are trying to get Ukrainians food and medical supplies, but it's hard. The Red Cross says the situation in Mariupol is getting dire and desperate. Ukraine's President Zelensky is saying this morning Russia wants to humiliate his people. Matt Bradley is live in Lviv. Matt, Lviv has been such a major transit point for Ukrainians leaving to Poland. It's about a 90-minute drive to the border there. Diplomats spoke again today. They didn't make any progress. The shelling continues. And those humanitarian corridors everyone's been talking about, those are blocked by Russia. So it seems like it's becoming even more desperate and dangerous for civilians trying to get out there. You've been there this entire time, Matt. Are you getting a sense that it's worsening?
Yeah, I mean, actually, this entire time we've been crisscrossing the country. We were up in Kharkiv earlier. We were down in Dnipro in the east. And then now we're here in Lviv, and we were actually up in Rivne towards the northwest just a couple of days ago. The situation here is getting increasingly dire for most people. And, you know, this is something, even when they're not in the line of fire, even when they're not in a city that's facing a lot of regular shelling, they're becoming increasingly anxious and hateful of the Russians. And so this is a pattern that we're seeing everywhere that I've gone throughout Ukraine. I think that it is reaching a tipping point, and one thing that you hear from a lot of people is they have this one wish that you're hearing from both the government and from ordinary people in the street. They want the no-fly zone that the West is so reluctant to impose. And that's something that I'm hearing from just about everybody. It's not some lofty notion. It is something that everybody wants to see. And one of the things that I'm also hearing from a lot of people, particularly in government and particularly in local positions throughout the country, is that this is not just Ukraine's war. It's fought over Ukrainian land. It's Ukrainian people who are fighting for it. But this is a war that the West needs to support, because the future of the West and the future of Western people's happiness, as we've constantly heard, is at stake. And that's one of the things that people here find so deeply unfair, is that the West isn't throwing in the kind of support that they need, considering they have as much skin in the game as Ukrainians are, as far as they're concerned, as Ukrainians do. Vicki?
The world is getting smaller, Matt. We are increasingly encircled with each other. And speaking of the West, we have Vice President Harris stopping just short of directly accusing Russia of committing war crimes, saying the country should be investigated. But Poland's president went further. He said war crimes are, quote, obvious. And today, Linda Thomas Greenfield says Russia's actions overall are war crimes. Matt, what are you hearing?
I mean, one of the things that we keep hearing about is Mariupol and that attack on that maternity hospital or the children's hospital. That has become really a crucible in this country. It's become a symbol for a lot of people here, and we've heard it from President Zelensky. I heard it from the mayor of Rivne, the town we were just in a couple of days ago. Everybody here is pointing at Mariupol and pointing at that particular incident in which only 3 people died, and I should say only. Obviously, that's a terrible tragedy, but it really has become symbolic when you consider the amount of death and destruction and injury that we're seeing across the country, that this particular incident is rising out of the ashes and becoming a symbol for so many people. And that is one of the things that I think when people talk about war crimes, when international institutions discuss war crimes, they're pointing their fingers at Mariupol. And that's a pattern that's developing across the country, that the Russians are sort of, lashing themselves around these cities, surrounding them, and we're starting to see the same thing in Kyiv. Vicky?
Matt Bradley all over Ukraine, bringing us that comprehensive reporting. Thank you, Matt. Well, some breaking news before we came on the air from the January 6th committee. We are learning Michael Flynn, you remember, he was the national security advisor under Trump. Well, he testified today in a closed-door meeting with the committee. They sent a letter to Flynn back in November with a subpoena compelling him to testify about an Oval Office meeting. It happened back in December of 2020. But according to a statement from Flynn's lawyers, he took the fifth. He declined to answer any of the committee's questions. Garrett Hake joins me now. Garrett, remind us what went down in that December meeting. Why is that meeting so important to the January 6th committee?
Well, you have to go back even further than that. Flynn, who was fired from his job as national security advisor pretty early on in the Trump administration, never really left Donald Trump's circle, as was often the case. And then after the election, in the lead up to January 6th, that December 18th meeting was one in which he reportedly recommended seizing voting machines. He was very public, apparently both in that meeting and after the fact, talking about seizing voting machines or invoking martial law, rerunning the election. Kind of some of the most outrageous ideas that were publicly put forward for ways for then President Trump to somehow remedy what he saw as a stolen election came from Mike Flynn. So that's why the committee wanted to talk to him.
Some of the initial sparks there. Flynn's lawyer is saying the committee isn't getting very many answers from his client, and this isn't the first time the committee has basically been iced out by a former Trump administration official. So how are they going to get around this, and where do they go from here?
Yeah, it's interesting. I felt like Flynn's appearance today might have been more of a strategy to keep him from being held in contempt than it was to cooperate in any meaningful way. As you pointed out, his lawyer said he was invoking his Fifth Amendment privileges here today. He still has an active lawsuit against the committee pushing back on this subpoena in the first place. But like some of the other top Trump administration officials who have tried to push back, tried not to cooperate, the committee can go around this in other ways. They can subpoena phone records, email records. They've also been getting tons of cooperation voluntarily from aides, including to some of these very same Trump administration officials who've otherwise refused to cooperate. So they're really using the negative space around these officials and some of the folks who worked for them who maybe are less inclined to engage in expensive legal battles with the committee to get the information they need.
Garrett, we're also learning that the January 6th committee interviewed an aide to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. What do we know about that conversation?
Yeah, a senior aide on the House Administration Committee named Jamie Fleet. This is really interesting because this is one of the first people we know that they've talked to who actually had a hand or would have had a hand in the security planning that led up to January 6th. What was the House doing to secure itself? What was the posture of the Capitol Police? What were officials told, and when did they know what they knew? Kind of the nuts and bolts of how the House, and the House in particular, but really the Capitol more broadly, were kind of staged and prepared for that day. It's not as sexy as some of the investigatory elements that the committee has chased down, but it's the kind of information they're going to want to know to paint a complete picture of what happened that day.
Interesting use of the word sexy, Garrett. All right, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
You bet.
All right, well, no, it is not your imagination, and no, your paycheck didn't get smaller, although it feels that way. Everything is more expensive, and we actually have no indications right now that we're going to see any relief anytime soon. A new report out today shows inflation has risen 7.9% in the past year. Yeah, that is the highest level in 40 years. We're seeing the increases in food, energy, and housing prices. That's contributing the most to the spike. This all comes as gas prices have hit a record high for a third day in a row. The average in the U.S. today, $4.32 for a gallon. That's up 7 cents since just yesterday. And with oil costs continuing to skyrocket and concerns over rising food prices in the next couple of months, economists are really worried that inflation could reach double digits. Joining me now is Steve Leisman. Steve, we are looking at the biggest inflation increase since 1982. I remember my parents bought a home, their first home in the 80s, and they were telling me the interest rates back then were in the teens. It's hard for anybody right now to imagine that, but we're seeing this impact at the grocery store. A loaf of bread up 26 cents since last year. Eggs and ground beef are up. Bacon now over $1 more, averaging $6.27 a pound. So how much worse could this get?
You know, I think it can get quite a bit worse. And I think the way to think about it is to separate it to the price increases we saw before this invasion and price increases to come. The story here is that already, and this number today, the 7.9% number you gave, really did not include the price increases we've seen in the month of March or even at the end of February. So you had high inflation, accelerating inflation and broad-based inflation before we got to this war here. And now you're going to have the impact of higher oil prices, which leads to higher gasoline prices, which leads to prices of all the things that petroleum gets involved with, all the different products and doohickeys on in your entire house there. All that's going to go up, I think, quite a bit. And then you're going to have a food issue that maybe not exists right now, but the price of a bushel of wheat has gone up considerably. And so you may get another round of price increases when it comes to bread and other foodstuffs.
A slight bit of good news is some people have seen wage increases during the pandemic, but there are certain parts of the country or the workforce that are certainly more affected by this kind of inflation. Talk about that, and also what can the government actually do to lessen the effects on the average American person? I know there are 6 Democrats that are trying to at least remove the federal gas tax, which would, I think, bring down gas prices by 18 cents a gallon. What else can the government do to help the average consumer?
So, just on the first part of your question on wages, the average wage is going up more slowly than inflation is rising, 0.5%. But when we take that apart a little bit, it does turn out that those at the lower end of the income scale are doing better and doing better than those at the top of the income scale for a change. Obviously, this has not been the case for many decades, but it turns out that bringing, the competition for low and moderate income workers is, or salaried workers, is much greater than it is at the top, at least for the moment here. We'll see if that lasts, but they have that group of people is actually doing better than inflation because of the competition. When it comes to what else the government can do, there's a little bit of skepticism on the gas tax because it's unclear, to me anyway, and to others as well, if the gas stations pass that along. They might, if things are competitive out there, but they might just charge what they did before or some portion of it anyway without the gas tax. I think there's ideas about rebates. It's a very difficult thing to do to get the relief to those who need it most when it comes to the gas tax. And you're absolutely right, it is a gas tax when you have higher gasoline prices the way we do right now.
Steve Leisman breaking it down for us tonight on the economy side. Thank you. The White House today under increasing pressure to alleviate those rising prices at the pump and at the grocery store during a midterm year. They're putting the blame for rising energy prices on Russia. Biden is calling it Putin's price hike after the U.S. banned the import of Russian oil. It set the stage for some awkward new talks with Venezuela, which happens to have a lot of oil. And they just released 2 American detainees. That has some reports saying Venezuela did that in exchange for the U.S. easing up on sanctions that were already in place against that country. The White House is saying, no, that's not the case.
While they are a very large producer of oil, this is not currently at this moment an active conversation about importing their oil.
Venezuela, the elephant in the room, as President Biden met with Colombian President Ivan Duque today. Duque having publicly expressed his concerns over the U.S.'s negotiations with a dictatorship. Joining me now is Mike Memoli. Mike, Psaki says no, there are no active conversations about the U.S. importing Venezuelan oil, but there is still criticism the U.S. is putting sanctions on one dictator, then asking favors of another. How does the White House reconcile all of this and explain it?
Vicky, this has really been one of the toughest points of contention between the White House and, frankly, members of the president's own party this week, because we've seen some of the loudest voices of criticism of these talks with the Venezuelan government of Mr. Maduro being Democrats in Congress, obviously Republicans outraged as well. But really what we're seeing is one of the ripple effects, of course, of the situation in Ukraine has been the spike in gas prices, and one of the results of that has really scrambled some of the pillars of the Biden administration foreign policy, which is really not to deal with these dictatorial regimes. The White House really isn't saying what was being discussed between a U.S. delegation and Venezuelan leaders in the past week. They say actually there have been conversations happening over the course of the last few months focused primarily on releasing those detained Americans down there. But we're also seeing this play out in other ways as well. Remember, President Biden during the campaign called Saudi Arabia a pariah, said that the country had no redeeming social value. Well, we're also seeing the White House having to deal more with the Saudi government, again, having to deal with trying to boost oil production to try to lower prices. And so the White House said that Biden doesn't, stands by his comments about Saudi Arabia from the campaign, but we're seeing that battle of the 21st century, autocracies versus democracies, scrambled a bit as the Biden administration has had to have some difficult conversations with these governments that they wanted to keep at arm's length.
Well, let's talk about inflation, Mike. The White House isn't shying away from the fact Americans are being hit hard. Psaki, like Biden, on behalf of Biden, still shifting blame to Russia today. And some polls show, look, Americans in the interim, some of them are okay paying more for gas to punish Russia. How long do you think that goodwill, that sentiment is going to last? Will Americans tolerate this policy? And then we're coming up in the midterms. How do you think that's going to play out for Biden and the Democrats if costs still continue to rise?
Yeah, the administration obviously for a long time has been pinning the inflation on the pandemic, which is true, right? The disruption in supply chains primarily leading to higher prices, more difficult in getting goods to the market here. The obvious price spike because of gas has been a huge driver of inflation. We actually don't even see the recent spike in gas prices in these most recent inflation numbers. But the White House is maintaining two tracks. One is now blaming this on Putin squarely for the moment, and there is polling that suggests the American people are willing to pay higher gas prices, at least in the near term, because of this situation. In the long term, we will eventually see the White House getting back to pushing a domestic agenda. Yes, it's not Build Back Better anymore, building a better America, trying to get some specific pieces of legislation through that they say will help deal with the longer-term core issues involving inflation. But this is obviously going to be a big issue in the midterm elections. That's why you saw the president use his State of the Union address, one, to talk about what he's going to do about it, but first, even before that, to say he understands Americans' problems. He's got to show that empathy. That's really the barrier to entry before he can even talk about what he wants to do next.
Yeah, money is going to be on a lot of voters' minds. Mike Memoli, thank you. Well, Britain just added 7 more oligarchs to its list of sanctioned Russian oligarchs, including billionaire Roman Abramovich. Now he can no longer travel to the UK. His assets are frozen, and he can't do business with any UK citizens either. Prime Minister Boris Johnson in a statement saying there can be no safe havens for those who have supported Putin's vicious assault on Ukraine. Abramovich is the owner of Chelsea, one of the UK's most popular soccer teams. He had recently said he would be selling the team. It's reportedly worth $2.1 billion. Well, those plans, that's not going to happen now. He's also believed to own a bunch of properties in the UK, including, check this one out, 15-bedroom mansion in West London's Kensington Palace Gardens. That is what you're looking at there, just behind the gate. We can't get past there. Tom Winter joins me now. Tom, Abramovich managed to avoid this for a very long time. Now it's happening. How big of a deal is it? And my second part of the question is, look, you freeze my assets, I'm in trouble. I go to the ATM, I can't get any money out. If you're an oligarch, don't you have money stashed? I mean, what's the reality for him on the day-to-day?
Well, I think you've hit on a couple of things there. First off, I think it is significant because this is somebody who's really well known. You know, a lot of these oligarchs are not that well photographed. I mean, we can pick up maybe 10 or 15 photos of them. This is somebody who's very public. He owns one of the most popular soccer teams, or at least well-known soccer teams. I don't want to get in trouble with our football fans, in the UK, in the world, frankly. So I think the fact that he's been targeted today is important. He's somebody who came up through Yeltsin, was close with Yeltsin, somebody who knew Putin as he was coming up. So this is somebody who's been really interwoven with the Russian government for a long time. With respect to his assets, yeah, they're absolutely frozen in the UK. But to your point, these guys have billions. They spend millions on lawyers and on making sure that they have wealth tucked away in a number of places. Right. One of those places might be through his daughters, who have dual U.S. and Russian citizenship.
I was hoping you were going to mention something about yachts, models, and bottles, like you do every time we talk about oligarchs. All right, well, so he's alleged to have these very strong ties to President Putin.
Sure.
He has denied it. What do we know about the nature of their relationship?
Well, according to the UK, and in their documentation today, which we have, that details his background, his past, and why they're sanctioning him, they say that they have a decades-old relationship. And based on his businesses and the business interests he has had in the past, namely Gazprom, his interests in the steel industry and in the oil and natural gas industries in Russia, you don't get those unless you're close to Vladimir Putin. It's just that clear. And both the UK and US officials have said that. So while he's not in hot water here yet from an asset standpoint, he's somebody who's very much on the US's radar and somebody who they absolutely have assessed has a close tie to Putin. And even this effort potentially in the Ukraine saying that his steel company might be supplying some of the steel for the Russian military and for Russian tanks.
Yesterday, you were in the same seat talking to Stephanie Gosk about Deripaska.
Right.
We've also heard about Igor Sechin. These are all oligarchs that have been sanctioned by the UK. Their combined network is something ridiculous, like $20 billion.
Right.
So this latest move, what kind of pressure lever does it turn on? I mean, does it make a difference with Putin and what he's doing in Ukraine?
Well, I think the UK portion of this is important because the UK has traditionally not had very transparent laws and protections in place to determine who actually has what assets and where. And I think the fact that this is going to be frozen and that the UK banks are going to have to pay attention to this could actually put the squeeze on. I mean, we're talking about a guy who has $9.7 billion. And really what we're playing here, Vicky, is a global game of whack-a-mole. So if you can't do business in the UK, and for some of these people that you just mentioned, we talked about Deripaska yesterday. We talked about Chemezov on Monday. You've got on Tuesday, rather. So you've got the KGB hardliner and Chemezov. You got the business hardliner in Deripaska with ties to Russian organized crime, came up in the special counsel's investigation.
About the aluminum mafia.
The aluminum wars and Russian organized crime, exactly right. We've got somebody here, Abramovich, today, who was a part of that. At one point, he said, why do I want to get too into it? Seems like somebody dies every 3 days. That was the type of stuff that was going on. So as this global game of whack-a-mole for these assets continues, it's going to be harder for them to find places to park it. It's going to be harder for them to find places to move money. If they can't move money in and out, they can't move money in and out to potentially help the Russian government continue with the invasion they've started in Ukraine.
Tom Winter, as always, making difficult things easier for us to understand. We appreciate it. Stick around. You're going to like this story. You're a baseball fan, right?
Yes.
Of course. Who isn't, right? Okay. Well, it's breaking news. Bust out the peanuts and Cracker Jack. The lockout is over and baseball is back. After nearly 100-day lockout, Major League Baseball owners and the Players Union have finally reached a tentative agreement on a new labor deal. If everyone signs off, we're going to get the full 162-game season this year. Opening day is set for April 7th. There are some rule changes, too. The designated hitter, the DH, finally comes to the National League, and the postseason expands to 12 teams. Morgan Chesky is all over this story tonight. Morgan, this is the first work stoppage baseball has had in 26 years. Finally, it's over. It almost took 100 days. Walk us through what both sides are getting and the tentative agreement that's been reached.
Yeah, there's a lot in play here, Vicky. 99 days going back and forth. And frankly, it did look pretty bleak for a long time. And there was growing talk that we wouldn't even have the beginning of a season here. But included in all of these changes is, as you mentioned, the designated hitter coming to the National League. I actually enjoyed watching pitchers take whiffs at pitches, but unfortunately, that is changing for this upcoming season, which begins in early April. And among the other changes here, as we kind of go down this list that took so long to agree upon from both sides, includes a 45-day window for MLB to implement rule changes. And among these potential rule changes that could happen in this 45-day window, we're talking about a pitch clock, meaning how long between the pitcher, between pitches for the pitcher, ban on shifts from defensive outfielders moving around depending upon who's in the batter's box, and actually larger bases. That's up for discussion as well as a potential change for this 2023 season. I know, I never would have thought that. National League, as you mentioned, adopting the DH. There's also a draft lottery. Now, this is important because it's implemented with the intent of trying to keep a team from tanking. worst record in the league, higher draft pick with this draft lottery. They would hope that it would change that to keep things more competitive as the season goes on. They would also have draft pick inducements to discourage service time manipulation. And then they want to limit the number of times a player can be optioned to the minor leagues in one season. So among all of these changes, the base salary was one of the biggest sticking points, and that I should add that has been raised from $570,000 to $700,000, and this would apply to those young players just in the league 3 years or less, getting a relatively significant raise here. And we're not talking about the big names that you would see, in advertisements, et cetera. And this was one of the biggest sticking points from the players' union throughout this entire ordeal. And frankly, it was one of the reasons why a lot of people didn't think this would even happen. This agreement finally reached now 99 days after it began. I remember covering this back in early December, thinking it would be a relatively short discussion. And here we are, well into spring now.
Yeah.
Fortunately, we will have baseball coming back. Vicki?
Well, that is good news. Morgan, let me ask you a couple things, because I think you know a thing or two about the game. It's very traditional. It's America's pastime. So how do you think fans, well, first of all, how do you think the game is going to change? If we're talking about the pitch clock, does that speed things up? You said bigger plates. Does that make it easier to, like, steal bases or, score a run, right? Because it's easier. It's bigger. And then the whole designated hitter, that was funny. You said you liked watching pitchers having to, hit, and they're not very good. So now somebody else can come in and hit for them, right? So how does this change the game for fans?
I don't think it'll be anything drastic. I do think that for those who grew up with the game, they may have staunch opinions one way or the other, but the casual fan shouldn't notice anything too incredibly different. I do think the shift, the ban on shifts is going to be interesting to see, especially in the playoffs, because by this point, when you've seen a player kind of go through an entire season, you have the outfields and the infields, for that matter, who have seen dozens, if not more than 100 games of where they primarily hit the ball, and they can kind of shift accordingly, cover that part of the field. And a lot of people say that took away the essence of the game, if you will. That was the argument. And meanwhile, you have defensive-minded players and coaches who say you should absolutely do this to better increase the odds of getting an out. So that'll be interesting to see. I don't know if the bases are going to be significantly larger to the point where we would actually notice it with a naked eye looking and watching the game on TV. But that pitch clock could actually, as you mentioned, speed the game up. And I know for a lot of people who may be just casual fans, you're sitting there, you're watching, maybe speeding it up, not a horrible thing here. So time will tell. Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, hey, there's going to be baseball, so that's the good news out of all this. We appreciate you, Morgan. Thank you. Coming up, New Yorkers with previous marijuana convictions, well, they're going to get first dibs on retail licenses to sell pot. Yeah, you heard me right. We'll tell you why after the break. Plus, were you hoping to get rid of your mask when you traveled? Well, the TSA is going to extend mask mandates on planes and public transportation for another month. Why the agency is making the move and what this means for your spring break plans. Just a few hours ago, New York rolled out a plan to give the first licenses in the state to sell marijuana to people who've had prior marijuana-related convictions. Yeah, the state basically saying it wants to do this to level the playing field by giving a leg up to people who have traditionally been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. Governor Kathy Hochul's administration has vowed to create the most diverse marijuana industry in the nation. Hochul wants New York to pass legislation that would provide $200 million to support these businesses. A lot of those dispensary licenses, well, they're also expected to go to women, minorities, distressed farmers, and veterans. And, of course, aiming to give convicted felons dispensary licenses comes with a lot of criticism. New York State Senator Rob Ortt has already voiced his concerns with giving taxpayer dollars to, quote, those who have broken the law. Ron Allen following this for us tonight. He joins us here. Ron, thank you so much for being here. So here we are. They're going to be evaluating these applicants based on all sorts of things. But it sounds like having a felony conviction is not a deal breaker. And it, in fact, could help push you to the front of the line.
It does push you to the front of the line. That and some business experience. They're not just going to give these to anybody. But the underlying concern is social equity. This notion that the war on drugs, marijuana arrests disproportionately hurted hurt communities of color. And all this legislation that's been passed in various states, Illinois, California, Michigan, Massachusetts, is designed to the marijuana business is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the laws are designed to try and get some of that money back to the communities, back to people who are harmed, not just by getting licenses to individuals, but funding schools, other health projects, things of that nature as well. But New York, this is a bold step because they're taking people with convictions, putting them at the front of the line, maybe as many as 200 or so.
Wow.
And they're funding it. The biggest problem getting into the marijuana industry is money. So imagine that. And so the governor is trying to get into the budget some $200 million, which will help these people overcome the biggest obstacle.
Are these like grants? Are they small business loans? Are they, because obviously the people who are already in the industry from other states, et cetera, they have an advantage, right? They're already established. So if you're a small business hoping to start a dispensary, how does that $200 million come to you?
I think that remains to be seen, some of the details. And the bottom line is that there's anticipated a lot of tax revenue, billions, that's going to come back. And some of this money is going to have to be returned to the state. So, yes, I guess there's a scenario where you get a loan.
Like a startup grant or startup loan?
Exactly. And then when you make your millions, you send it back to the state in taxes. I don't think they're giving a lot away for free. But the bottom line is that there's a lot of social consciousness involved in this legislation. And there is some opposition. People like the congressperson you quoted who feel like, this is rewarding bad behavior. But on the other hand, there are people who feel that something fundamentally wrong happened.
Right. People were punished disproportionately.
And there are studies that suggest that that was the case. And these laws are being passed to try and correct that wrong. And the marijuana industry, the legal marijuana industry, is thought to be so lucrative that there's a lot of money that's going to be used for those purposes. And there'll be individuals, entrepreneurs, equity entrepreneurs they're called, who will get a shot at these licenses that in many states are limited. It's unclear how many New York is going to give out, but New Jersey, for example, is limiting the number.
Okay.
They're doing something similar. Their system is kind of bogged down. But the bottom line is, yes, this is a very novel program, and there's money behind it to get it started.
All right, Ron Allen breaking that down for us. Thank you so much, Ron. Good to see you. Well, let's get you over to the 5 things that our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, Republican Congressman Madison Cawthorn. He's been charged with driving with a revoked license. This is the second time the North Carolina lawmaker's been charged with driving with a revoked license. There's another incident back in 2017 before he was elected to Congress. He's scheduled to appear in court in May. Number 2, Florida legislators passed a GOP-backed bill to create a police force to investigate voter fraud. The bill would provide almost $4 million to look into reports of election crimes in that state, even though there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud there. It now heads to Governor Ron DeSantis' desk. Number 3, a report from the U.S. Census Bureau shows big undercounts of Black people, Latinos, and Native Americans. Meanwhile, non-Hispanic white people were overcounted at almost double the rate in the last decade. Officials say this is an ongoing trend that has serious impact on things like voting districts and how states spread out their funding. Number 4, Novak Djokovic. Well, he can't compete again at 2 tournaments here in the U.S. because he's unvaccinated and he can't travel to the country. The tennis star will be missing both the Indian Wells Masters and the Miami Open. He's played in only 1 tournament this year because of his vaccination status, and you will remember Djokovic was deported from Australia back in January, and he couldn't defend his title there. Number 5, researchers say giant spiders could, quote, colonize the entire East Coast this spring by literally parachuting down from the sky with those silken webs that they spin. Joro spiders, they're an invasive species native to Asia. They get as big as the palm of your hand. That's including the legs, not the body. It's unclear how the critters made it all the way to the U.S., but luckily, scientists say they are harmless to humans. They're timid, they're shy. If they bite you, their teeth can't even, their fangs can't pierce your skin. That's what I read, so don't freak out. Now, just as those mask mandates on planes and public transportation were set to expire this month, the TSA is now saying it will extend the mandate until April 18th. This means the mask stays on in airports, on planes and trains, and for your morning commute on buses and subways. The announcement comes just weeks after the CDC says most Americans are now safe to go without a mask indoors. So Why do we still have to wear them on planes, trains? Joining me now is Heidi Presbala. Heidi, if indoor mask guidelines have been lifted, then why are we seeing this extension on the travel and public transportation side?
Yeah, it seems confusing, but it's really not. Let me break it down here. So they're just buying more time. The real news here, Vicky, is that they're working on a framework that does not include universal masking on airplanes, buses, and trains for the long term. This is more so the news than the 30-day extension. There are consultations taking place right now, Vicky, between the Department of Transportation and the CDC to determine when, forever and ever, masks will be required and when they won't be. Officials are telling me it's one thing to set these benchmarks, which they've already done at the local level, but when you're making health and safety decisions based on data coming from multiple locations, as is the case with travel, it's a different challenge, and they don't want to rush into this. So this is about putting in place a policy that can respond responsibly to these peaks and valleys of the virus that are just going to be part of living with endemic COVID, Vicky.
So they're buying some more time so they can make a more comprehensive policy. And that date
Exactly.
is April what? April 18th?
April 18th, so extending a month from March 18th, which is when it's supposed to expire. And then hopefully they're going to have something that is comprehensive. If we get a wave in the summer or we get a wave in the fall, we're not going to have unruly passengers who are causing a ruckus and a problem. As we've seen, that'd be a big problem because they were told you can unmask when in fact it's going to be just a part of life, that there's going to be periods where we have to mask and periods where we don't. It's just more complicated when you're dealing with multiple localities and people that are mobile.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Heidi Presbala, thank you so much. So don't chuck those masks quite yet. All right, well, still to come, on the ground in Poland, what life is like for thousands of Ukrainian refugees who've escaped Russia's invasion. We'll also tell you what you can do to help as the humanitarian crisis worsens. That's next. More than 2 million refugees have fled Ukraine since the Russian invasion. That's more than half of them are children. That's according to UNICEF. There are no signs of this mass exodus letting up anytime soon. Today, hundreds of Ukrainian refugees once again packed a train station in Krakow as they take their next steps in their journey as a refugee, not knowing exactly where they're going in some cases. Ellison Barber is there. Ellison, what are you seeing where you are today? Where are folks going? You've been there. You've been in the camps. You've been playing soccer with the kids. And I imagine every day it's a different story, many different stories.
Yeah, it really is. It's so many different stories, but at the same time, the core of them are so similar. All these very different people having similar traumatic experiences and then just trying to do the best they can for themselves, for their families in the immediate hours, days. You know, we started our coverage at border crossings, going to 6 different runs. Now we're in Krakow because this is sort of the next step for a lot of people after they've crossed into Poland. A lot of the train stations in the border towns, they come to bigger cities like this one. And what we have seen here in the train station is just platforms packed with people waiting, trying to get some sort of assistance, trying to figure out what they do next. At one of the train stations where we were today, we saw this line just full of people waiting, many of them hours, to get up to the front to try and get some information about whether or not they potentially could have a room, a place to stay for the coming days or weeks in the Krakow area. There was one person we met, a man who was too frustrated to speak on camera. He'd waited in line for 3 hours only to get to the front and be told that they were out of rooms and they did not have a specific place for him to stay. For a lot of people, that means they're going to, at least for a little while, have to either sleep in train stations or stay at makeshift shelters while they try to figure out what is available and where they can go next. Vicki?
Ellison, we've seen a lot of generosity from volunteers, people stepping up to help as much as they can. You've spoken to some of them, including a mother who came from Ukraine. 2.3 million refugees at this point have left Ukraine. We've seen a lot of chaotic scenes. Are things stabilizing at all? Is there any more of a systematic way of welcoming folks and then getting people to safety?
I mean, the simple answer is that they're doing the best they can, but when you need help, the best someone can do is not always good enough, right? Because you have children who need help. You have a lot of things going on, and the best someone can do, it's often not immediate enough. The Polish government, they're working with trying to get accommodations for people as they come into. They were leading the charge on that train platform I was talking about earlier. And then we've also met volunteer groups, the Scouts here in Krakow, running one of these sort of makeshift shelters, trying to find places for people to stay, work for some people. And one thing that has been amazing to see both in the city in Krakow and then also at some of the border crossings are refugees who have come in needing help, having to flee their own homes, and then making the decision, particularly if they speak Polish, that they should actually become part of this volunteer effort to help other Ukrainians. And we met someone like that today. Listen to what she told us. Why want to help when you're dealing with a lot too?
Because I can help. That's why I want to help. Because I have time to do something for my people. Because I see people's stories is more sad than my story. That's why I want to be helpful here.
That's sort of one of the amazing things about covering devastating situations is when you are in the darkest places, you always seem to find the brightest lights. People like that woman who dealing with a lot of stuff herself, worried about her own children, still finding time to help other people because she thinks for kids especially to hear a familiar voice, someone speaking Ukrainian, that it's a comfort for them when they really need it. Vicki.
Oh, that's remarkable. Ellison Barber, thank you so much. We appreciate you. And it's the stories and images like that that Ellison and many others are bringing you that have a lot of us here wondering, how can we help? So we've actually put together a list of vetted organizations letting people know that you can actually make an impact from 6,000 miles away.
Thousands of refugees pour across the border into places like Poland. There are volunteers there to meet the immediate needs on the ground. They're distributing food, toys, and other supplies to those just trying to figure out what's next. But they can't do it alone. It's donations that help them feel comfort in a time of so much uncertainty. Aid groups say one of the quickest ways to make an impact is through donating money to a trusted organization, like World Central Kitchen. That organization is taking donations to help feed people as Chef Jose Andres serves up meals for those arriving at the border.
Nothing sends a bigger message of hope than a humble plate of food.
A group called Global Empowerment Mission, based in Miami, is on the ground in Poland using donations to buy train and plane tickets for refugees to get them to friends and family for more stable housing. They're also setting up a warehouse to distribute mountains of donations. For those innocent children who spent 2 years in a global pandemic and are now displaced because of Russia's invasion, organizations like Save the Children's Ukraine Crisis Relief Fund or the Red Cross, who says its volunteers have been in Ukraine for 8 years, are putting themselves in danger as they work to help those affected by the invasion. Another group, Razom for Ukraine, says they're focused on the need for medical aid for Ukrainian hospitals. Some folks are donating in innovative ways. Airbnb is allowing users to book rentals in the war-torn country and waiving service fees. That way, the money used to rent the place goes directly to the Ukrainian owner, even though the people who booked the place don't plan to stay. The company itself is also offering free, short-term housing for those displaced by the invasion. For those that need a ride out of Ukraine, Uber is offering free rides between the Ukrainian and Polish border and 2 Polish cities. They're also working with the International Rescue Committee to help those displaced.
If you'd like to see a list of trusted nonprofits, well, you can get out your phone. We've got a QR code. Just turn on the camera app, scan it. A link will come up. And if you click that link, it will take you to our NBC reporting with even more information on how to help. And just a reminder, with the good can also come the bad. Here's how to avoid getting scammed. For starters, you want to use a credit card because your credit card offers more layers of protection to help prevent scams. Also, beware of donation emails or texts that come to you that are unsolicited, that ask for an urgent donation right now. Do your research on those trusted nonprofits. Look up organizations on charity sites like Charity Navigator or GuideStar.org. Well, still ahead, police are searching for a woman caught on camera stealing thousands of dollars worth of cosmetic injectables. What we know about the so-called Botox bandit, that's next. And what kind of punishment is actor Jussie Smollett facing after his conviction for falsely reporting a hate crime attack against himself? Those details straight ahead. Still Still to come, teens once held in solitary confinement for weeks on end, some in the pitch black for upwards of 23 hours a day. We're going to take you inside Louisiana's harshest juvenile lockup and hear why some call the conditions there child abuse. But first, NBC News covers hundreds of stories each day, and because you couldn't possibly read, watch, or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we love to call The Local. From our West Coast Bureau, authorities say a construction worker found a mummified body in the wall of the Oakland Convention Center in California. It was found during some renovations. Officials don't have a lot of details right now, but they say the body was preserved in good condition. Their plan now is to determine who it is and how it got there. From our Midwest Bureau, police in Kentucky are looking for a woman who stole $10,000 worth of Botox. I know it sounds like a lot, but that stuff's expensive. It happened at a salon in Pioneer Village. Video shows the thief breaking in with a wrench and a hammer before making off with the goods. Authorities are asking for the public's help in finding this Botox bandit. And from our Northeast Bureau, one New England fisherman wants to help Ukraine by selling an unusual catch. Captain Tim Ryder pulled in a 7-pound woolly mammoth tooth last December. The 12,000-year-old fossil is being kept at his restaurant in Maine. It's up for auction on eBay till Sunday. Take a look at that thing. It's kind of cool. Ryder says 100% of the proceeds will go to helping Ukrainian refugees. If you ever wanted that woolly mammoth tooth. All right, well, actor Jussie Smollett is in court today waiting for a sentencing after he was convicted last year for lying to police about a racist and homophobic attack that he staged. You may remember this crazy story. It began in 2019 when Smollett reported to Chicago police 2 men wearing ski masks beat him and hurled racial and homophobic slurs at him. This is police body cam video from that night. The actor, who is black and gay, also said that the attackers threw a chemical in his face and wrapped a noose around his neck. Well, after an extensive investigation, authorities say Smollett actually had recruited those 2 men that he knew. He wanted to stage an attack in order to advance his career. That is a claim the actor continues to deny. They're back in the courtroom today after taking a short break. I want to bring in Jesse Kirsch now. Jesse, Smollett's attorneys argued for hours to get a new trial. Smollett's still saying he's innocent. So walk us through what's happened in court today so far. We know a lot of his family members are there.
Yeah, so, Vicky, a lot of time was spent this afternoon debating a defense motion to have the verdict overturned or have a new trial come forward. The judge, after hearing arguments at length from the defense as well as hearing from the prosecution, denied that defense motion. So they're in the middle of the sentencing hearing right now, and we've been following along with that live. And you just hit on one of the key points that the special prosecutor is discussing right now. Jussie Smollett had maintained his innocence all the way through the trial. He testified saying there was no hoax during the trial, and he has now been convicted of these crimes unanimously by a jury. So the special prosecutor is emphasizing right now as a factor for aggravation, an argument for aggravation when the judge decides his sentence, that Jussie Smollett has never taken ownership of what he is said to have done. His brother spoke in court a short time ago and was very vocal about saying, I'm not here to relitigate what went on in the trial. We're looking at a sentence or a decision that has been reached by the jury, so I'm just asking for leniency. So that's where things stand right now. The two sides are going back and forth, and we're still waiting to hear what sentence the judge will give Jussie Smollett.
Interesting to see if the judge goes more lenient or less lenient if he hasn't really taken accountability or accepted that guilty verdict. I want to ask you about this. What do you think this has done for the Chicago community, the impact of this case, and also on hate crime victims? Because every time there is a false report like this and resources are spent and then the outcome, you know, this is an extreme case, but when it's not true, what does that do for people who are the actual victims of hate crimes?
There are so many things that the city, that prosecutors have pointed to. The tangible, let's start there. The city says that there were more than $130,000 in overtime costs that the Chicago Police Department had to bill for having detectives and officers working around the clock to try to track down criminals who, it turns out, they say, were just associates of Mr. Smollett who were part of a staged hate crime. Then it's the fact that they're taking officers away from investigating other crimes. This was going on in a very cold time of severe in January 2019. And so there's the physical harm that people could be putting themselves through. The police department says officers and detectives and their families were under immense stress investigating all this. And then there's just the perception problem. So there are a lot of issues that the city and prosecutors are arguing as aggravating factors here.
Jesse Kirsch, thank you so much for your reporting. We'll follow the sentencing. We appreciate it. Well, it is time to get to one of the coolest segments on this show. It's called The Backstory. It's our behind-the-scenes look at how a story comes together and how it fits into our bigger picture. Imagine a place where kids are held in solitary confinement for 23 hours. That's what was happening at a juvenile facility in Louisiana. That's according to a new NBC report. Teens there destroying beds and light fixtures, using shards of glass to break the walls, trying to escape like this. You can see the holes there. The American Medical Association condemning isolating young people. They say it can lead to depression and anxiety. The report finding the facility also didn't offer formal education to the young people in its care for more than 3 months. Guards used police-style maneuvers on teenagers, and those kids were shackled even when they were outside their cells. Louisiana's Office of Juvenile Justice, which runs the facility, has denied these allegations. And while the young people at this facility have committed serious crimes like stealing cars or guns, no one deserves this kind of treatment. Unlike adult prisons, juvenile systems aren't meant to punish young people for breaking the law. They're actually supposed to help them rehabilitate, go on, lead productive lives. Aaron Einhorn, who reported on this story with ProPublica and the Marshall Project, joins me now. Hey, Aaron, this is a moving report, an important one. It shines a spotlight on something that not a lot of people knew was going on. Talk to us about how you heard about this and what surprised you about what you uncovered.
Yeah, actually, this had started as a story about, we were looking at what happened with education in juvenile justice facilities during the pandemic. And we started calling around to advocates around the country saying, you know, what's happening in your area? And we spoke with some advocates in Louisiana who told us about this facility. They said, we have this facility where there's education happening at all. So, you know, we started looking into it. And in fact, it was actually far worse than even these advocates knew about. You know, it wasn't just that they were being deprived of an education. You know, they were being held in solitary around the clock. They were, you know, their legs and they were being handcuffed and shackled with leg irons every time they left. You know, they were being pepper sprayed, subjected to harsh discipline when they got out of line. You know, and the facility was chaotic, violent. I mean, you know, incident reports just showing, you know, kids, you know, throwing feces at guards. I mean, it was just this, you know, ripping the light fixtures and using the metal shards to rip holes in their walls. I mean, just really, you know, alarming conditions. You know, education being a huge part of it, obviously, but you know, it was much bigger than we started out looking at.
Aaron, you talked to a woman, Rebecca McDonald. Her 16-year-old was in solitary confinement for at least a month in that Louisiana facility. What did she say about how he was treated, her son, and how did you convince her to speak publicly about this?
I mean, all of the parents that we spoke with, you know, told a similar story. You know, these are kids, many of them with severe mental health issues. You know, they need serious help. And, you know, their kids were taken away from them, put in these facilities. And instead of being given help, you know, the parents were telling us, you know, that their kids weren't getting anything. You know, they were just being locked up, just being shackled, you know, and you know, we know how hard it is to come back from, you know, an experience in the criminal justice system as a young person. And then if you're not getting an education, they need intense therapy and they're not getting it. And so, you know, the parents that we spoke with, and we also interviewed, you know, a young man who was in the facility, you know, and they just told us, you just have to, you know, they didn't have books or paper in the cell with them. They were just kind of in there completely by themselves, you know, and there's extensive research on the psychological ramifications for a child, you know, or an adult who's being held in those conditions. So they were very concerned. And the reason they wanted to talk to us is because they wanted help for their kids, and they hoped that by speaking with us and sharing their stories that, you know, they could get that help.
Now, we certainly hope it makes a difference and that there will be some impact and some changes, and I know you'll stay on that story. Aaron Einhorn, thank you so much for your time with the Behind the Story this evening.
Thank you.
Wazinkle Esemwa will also have more on this reporting tonight on Top Story with Tom Yamas at 7 p.m. Eastern right here on NBC News Now. And That's a wrap for this hour. Hallie is on assignment. Our Kristen Welker will be in this seat for you tomorrow. Same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.